Inside the shadows, the rise of the organized crime family. Hook. The dim light flickered above him. His boots clicked against the damp concrete. A slow, deliberate sound. He was deep in the underground, far from the city's surface. The air was thick, stale. The walls felt as though they were closing in. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The corridor stretched ahead, shadows pooling in every corner. His heart raced with each step. The echoes of his footsteps were unnaturally loud. Then a low hum. It buzzed through the air, vibrating in his chest. He froze. What was that? His breath quickened. He reached for his gun, fingers trembling slightly. The hum grew louder. It was coming from somewhere ahead. The sound was not mechanical. It was something else. A murmur, a whisper, impossible to understand. A chill ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. The thought hit him like a slap. He took another step, more cautiously this time. The air seemed colder now. The concrete beneath his boots felt even colder. The whispering grew louder. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the hall. Tall, cloaked in shadow, a face hidden, but the eyes, those eyes, they glowed, bright, unnatural. The figure didn't move, but he could feel its presence. He was being watched. His breath came in shallow gasps. The figure remained still. He could hear his own heartbeat now, pounding in his ears. The silence was suffocating. He raised his gun, fingers tight on the grip. A sudden gust of wind, cold and bitter. It slammed into him, sending a shockwave through his body. The figure still didn't move, but something felt off. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. A voice echoed, deep and gravelly. "Welcome." The word hung in the air. It wasn't just a word. It was a command. Something twisted in his gut. He wanted to turn and run, but his body wouldn't obey. The glow from the figure's eyes seemed to grow stronger. Closer. Then he heard it. A growl, low and guttural, from behind him. He spun around. Nothing. But he could feel it. Something was moving, circling him. He was trapped. His pulse raced. The growl came again, closer this time. A shadow shifted just beyond his sight. The whispering intensified. His body trembled with fear. Something was closing in. He raised the gun higher, but his hand felt weak, his fingers slipping on the cold steel. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. A heavy silence, and then a sharp, blinding pain in his chest. His vision blurred. He gasped, but the breath never came. The world around him spun. His knees buckled. He dropped to the ground, vision fading. The last thing he heard was the voice again. "It's too late." His vision darkened, edges blurring into blackness. The pain in his chest spread, sharp and relentless. It wasn't just the wound. It was as if something inside him was being ripped apart. He gasped for air, but none came. A heavy pressure weighed down on his chest. The floor beneath him felt cold and unforgiving. His head spun, and his limbs were numb. The figure's glowing eyes were the last thing he saw before his mind fractured. He blinked, but the darkness didn't fade. His body refused to move. The silence pressed in on him, thick and suffocating. And then a sound, distant but familiar. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Each step a reminder that he wasn't alone. He could hear them approaching. Closer, closer. His mind screamed for him to move, but his body betrayed him. The footsteps stopped right beside him. He could feel the heat of someone standing there, hovering just above him. A shadow fell across his face, and then a low chuckle. It was soft at first, a cold, mocking sound, but it grew louder, more sinister. He could almost feel the breath of the person who stood over him. "I knew you'd be foolish enough to follow." The voice was unmistakable. It was the leader, the one who ran the whole operation, the one who never left the shadows. His breath was shallow now, but it still hurt. "Please," he managed to rasp, barely a whisper. "Please, no more." Another laugh, colder now. "You have no idea what you've walked into." The footsteps moved away. He couldn't see. He couldn't move. He wanted to scream, but the words stuck in his throat. Then silence again. His heart hammered in his chest. The world around him was a blur, an endless void. A sudden sensation gripped his throat. Cold fingers wrapping around his neck, tightening, squeezing. His body jerked, trying to break free. But the grip was ironclad. He fought, desperate. The world seemed to close in even further. Darkness, nothing but the pressure. And then the grip loosened. A breath, shallow but steady, filled his lungs. He couldn't tell if he was alive. The silence stretched on, dragging him deeper. But something had changed. The air felt different now. Heavy, more oppressive. He could feel something moving in the shadows. Something watching. The figure's voice broke the silence again. "Your time has come." The words echoed in his mind, but they made no sense. His vision was still blurred, but he could feel the presence closing in. It was almost suffocating. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through his chest, deep and unrelenting. The pressure in his chest returned, squeezing harder this time. His body stiffened, trying to fight, but he was too weak. The air tasted metallic, like blood. The cold fingers released their grip on his neck, but he couldn't breathe. The pain agonizing, sharp. It cut through everything. His eyes flickered, catching glimpses of something moving in the shadows. The figure was closer now, its glowing eyes burning into his soul. And then he heard it again, the voice. This time it was sharper, more certain. "Do you understand now?" His heart skipped a beat. The words sent a chill through his spine, icy and paralyzing. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, raw. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. The ground beneath him seemed to sink, like quicksand. The weight of the situation pressed harder. He could feel the walls closing in again, the shadows becoming more alive. They whispered now, their voices barely audible, but ever present. His head spun with fear and confusion. Something was terribly wrong. He could hear the footsteps again, drawing near. Slow, deliberate. The same as before. Each step deeper into the abyss. A cold breeze brushed past him, but it didn't feel like wind. It felt like something was breathing right next to him. He could almost feel its breath on his skin, hot and damp. It wasn't human. He could hear a growl again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was right beside him, vibrating in the very air around him. He didn't dare move, couldn't. He didn't want to know what was in the dark. And then, a sharp, electric crackle. The world around him shifted, warped. The shadows seemed to pulse and ripple. He gasped, feeling the sensation of being pulled, dragged deeper. The figure's voice, now closer than ever, whispered directly into his ear. "You should have stayed away." The words cut through him like a blade. He fought to breathe, to think, but everything was slipping away. He felt his body tremble uncontrollably. His mind was fading, drowning in the shadows. And then the world went black cold, dark. His senses swirled in a void of nothingness. He wasn't sure where he was, or if he was even still alive. A low hum echoed in the distance again, vibrating in his bones. The walls felt closer now, the air thinner. He could hear the faintest scrape of metal against concrete. It sent a shiver through him, but he couldn't move, couldn't even open his eyes. His mind, still clouded, refused to let him wake fully. There was a pressure, a weight on his chest again, a steady, rhythmic thump like a heartbeat. Not his. Something else, closer, and then a voice. Awake. It was soft, a command, a demand. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, cracked. A hand brushed across his forehead, cold, almost inhuman. He flinched, but he couldn't pull away. The touch was like ice, sliding down his skin. It lingered just a second too long. He could hear the figure now, standing over him, breathing in his ear. A soft chuckle. "You've seen too much." The words were calm, but they sent a shudder through him. He tried to move again. This time his body responded. Barely. His hand twitched. The figure's shadow hovered over him. It was tall, leaning closer. He could almost feel its eyes on him. A sudden, sharp pain jolted through his wrist. It was as if something was digging into him. Fingers thin and cold, clawing into his flesh. His mouth opened in a gasp, but nothing came out. The pressure tightened. His breathing shallow. Panic surged through his chest. This wasn't just fear. It was pure terror. The walls were closing in faster now. No escape. He could feel it. Something crawling beneath his skin. The figure's face, a blur of shadows, leaned in closer. A whisper brushed against his ear. "Do you know what we are?" The words sent a chill down his spine. He didn't have the strength to respond. His head swam, vision slipping in and out of focus. The figure's grip tightened. The growl echoed again, louder, more menacing. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he'd ever known. And it was coming for him. He tried to scream, but only a rasp escaped. The figure's laugh was low, almost predatory. Too late. The grip on his wrist loosened, but the pain lingered, sharp and burning. He could feel his body sinking, like he was being dragged into the earth. The floor was cold against his back, yet he could sense heat creeping through the darkness. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of something foul. It smelled like decay, a rancid, almost metallic odor that made his stomach churn. The growl, closer now, so close it rumbled through his bones. A monstrous, unnatural sound. His eyes shot open, but all he could see were shadows, flickering like flames in the dark. The figure moved, its outline more distinct now, still blurry but menacing. Its eyes, glowing like twin embers in the dark, locked onto his. A flash of movement, too quick to follow. The figure was right beside him, its breath cold on his neck. He couldn't escape. His body refused to move. The suffocating silence pressed against him, wrapping around his chest like a vice. And then, a sound that made his blood run cold. The unmistakable click of a trigger. He felt the pressure against his temple before he could react. He knew what was coming. The figure's voice, low and deliberate, whispered, "You don't understand, do you?" He could barely breathe, barely think. Every instinct screamed for him to get up, to fight. But he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The growl came again, closer this time. It was no longer distant, no longer a shadow. It was right next to him. He could feel it in the air, the sound vibrating through his chest. A shadow shifted just out of his line of sight, but the figure was still there. And then the voice, even closer now. "I didn't want it to be like this." A whisper, a promise. "I gave you a choice." The pressure on his temple increased, but his thoughts were slipping away. Everything felt heavy, dark. His vision flickered, edges blurring. He couldn't think straight. The cold metal against his skin felt like the only reality he could hold on to. The figure's eyes burned into him, its presence consuming everything around him. A deep breath, slow, deliberate. And then everything went still. The growl faded. The pressure on his head disappeared. His pulse thundered in his ears. For a moment, he thought he was free. But then, the shadows around him twisted again. Something moved, something far worse. The air thickened. The growl came again, but this time, it wasn't just one. It was dozens, hundreds, a chorus of hunger. Something worse than death itself was coming. The ground beneath him trembled, as if something massive was shifting. The air grew colder, thicker. His breath came in shallow gasps, the fog of his exhale swirling before him. The growls were louder now, surrounding him. They weren't just sounds, they were threats, promises of something far worse than pain. His heart pounded in his chest, wild and desperate. The shadows seemed to move, flicker, like they were alive, growing closer with each passing second. A low hiss, a sharp, slithering noise. He wanted to scream, to move, to escape. But his body was frozen, paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming presence in the darkness. The whispers returned, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, distorted and eerie. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the malice behind them. Something was coming for him. Closer, closer. The temperature dropped even further. A shiver ran through him, but it wasn't just cold. It was as if the very essence of fear was freezing his blood. He could hear the scraping of claws on stone, echoing in the dark. It was moving, not just the shadows, but the thing that had been waiting. A soft rustle, a flicker of movement too fast to follow, and then he felt it. A cold breath on the back of his neck, so close he could feel its jagged edges against his skin. He turned his head, but his body couldn't follow. The thing was behind him. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on him. Closer, closer. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The growl came again, louder this time, vibrating through his bones, rattling his very soul. He was no longer just terrified. He was broken. A voice, distorted and guttural, whispered in his ear, "You should have stayed away." The words were chilling. Asterisk final star. He wanted to move, to escape, but he knew it was too late. Something sharp, something alive, brushed against his cheek. A cold, slithering sensation. He tried to scream, but the air was gone. The shadows pressed in tighter, and with one last, deafening roar, everything went black. The darkness swallowed him whole. There was no sound, no light, no sensation, save the suffocating weight of nothingness. He couldn't tell if he was still breathing. His body felt distant, like it didn't belong to him anymore. A deep hum began again, slow and steady, like the pulse of something ancient, something malevolent. It resonated through his chest, through his bones, vibrating into his very soul. His eyes burned, but he couldn't open them. There was a sense of movement around him, just beyond his reach. He felt it again, something moving in the shadows, something watching. A cold whisper brushed across his ear. "Do you fear the dark?" The voice wasn't human. It was older, cracked, like the remnants of an ancient curse. He couldn't answer, couldn't form the words. He was trapped in the blackness, surrounded by an oppressive force, a presence that wrapped itself around him like chains. The weight on his chest returned, pressing harder this time. He gasped. No, he wanted to gasp, but there was no air. The pressure tightened, suffocating him. And then suddenly his body jolted awake. Not fully, not entirely. He was on his back, his eyes wide, his limbs stiff. The world around him was distorted, blurred shadows and warped shapes. The hum was gone, replaced by a steady drip, drip, drip. Water. The sound of water falling, dripping onto stone. He tried to move his head, but his body was still not his own. Something was wrong. He could feel it, the cold, the dampness, the chill seeping into his skin. The shadows pressed closer again, filling the room like a living thing. His throat was dry, cracked. A soft, wet laugh echoed in the distance, low and taunting. A shadow shifted near the corner of the room. It was human-shaped, but wrong. The figure's outline seemed to flicker like a dying flame. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All he could manage was a desperate, choking gasp. The figure moved toward him, slowly, purposefully. With every step, the air grew thicker, heavier. And then, the whisper. Too late. It was right beside him. The breath of the figure was cold against his face, like death itself exhaled onto him. His body stiffened in terror, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure leaned in closer, and for the first time he saw it. Its eyes, hollow and black, stared into him, empty, unfeeling. And then it spoke again, its voice soft and cruel. You should have listened. The weight on his chest lifted, but the cold remained. And suddenly, the shadows broke. The room, the walls, the air, all fractured. Reality itself splintered, torn apart by something far beyond his understanding. The last thing he heard was the echo of the figure's laugh. And then nothing. Nothing. Complete silence. For a moment, there was nothing but the absence of everything. No air, no sound, no life. He tried to open his eyes, but it felt like they were sealed shut. A darkness so thick, so heavy, it pressed against his eyelids. He wasn't sure if he was still alive. Was he even breathing? Slowly, cautiously, a single breath filled his lungs. The cold in the air shifted, moved. It brushed against his skin like ice, but it was not wind. It felt like something was crawling just beneath the surface. Something waiting. The faintest sound reached his ears. The scrape of something against stone. The claws. He couldn't move, couldn't think, but he could feel it. The presence. It was there. A voice, no, more like a series of murmurs, shifted through the air around him. So soft, so subtle. He couldn't make out the words, but they dripped with venom. And then, a sudden, sharp breath against his ear. So close he could feel the moisture on his skin. A voice, low and grating, whispered, "Asterisk, you're not alone, asterisk." The words sent a shock of fear through him. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to respond. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat a reminder of his helplessness. The murmurs intensified, becoming more distinct. Now they were no longer just whispers. They were voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once, in unison. Each voice, louder than the last. A chorus of voices, distant, close, overlapping. "You can't escape. You'll never escape. Asterisk, it's too late, star dot." He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. Just the rush of air filling his lungs, heavy and thick. The shadows around him began to pulse, undulate, as if they were alive, moving, shifting. The sensation of being watched returned. 1,000 eyes, unseen, but everywhere. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance. Weak, flickering, barely visible. It was a dim glow, but it seemed like a beacon in the endless dark. A glimmer of hope or a trap. He couldn't tell, but the figure was closer now. Its presence unmistakable. Its eyes, those burning, glowing eyes, pinned him in place. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was massive, looming, not human, not anything he could ever comprehend. The laugh from before, that same mocking laugh, echoed through the air again. "You thought you could escape." The figure's voice was deep, an endless pit of coldness. "You are already in the dark." The light flickered once more, brighter this time, but it didn't comfort him. Instead, it pulled him toward it like a current. He wanted to fight it, to turn away, but he couldn't. He was compelled to move toward it. His body ached. The weight in his chest was unbearable now. The figure's shadow stretched long, reaching toward him, consuming the flickering light. And as the dark swallowed him whole, one thought echoed in his mind. It was too late. The light flickered again, weak and desperate. But now, it felt like it was fighting against the dark. His body, still not fully his own, moved toward it. Each step felt like wading through thick, cold mud. He couldn't escape the weight pressing against him. It was as though the very ground beneath him wanted to hold him in place. He could hear the whispers now, clearer, louder, asterisk pounding asterisk through his skull. They were no longer just voices. They were thoughts, his thoughts, but twisted, corrupted. They're coming for you. Asterisk you belong to them, asterisk. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to move, step by agonizing step. The shadows shifted, moving like a living thing, closing in, drawing tighter. The growl, it came from somewhere far, yet so close. The low, menacing sound sent a chill through his veins. He stumbled, his foot catching on something he couldn't see, but somehow he found his balance again. The flickering light was just ahead, so close now, but the figure behind him was closer. It was following, stalking him. A low growl sounded just behind him, close enough that he could feel it vibrating in his chest. It was there. He dared not look back, but he could feel its eyes on him, burning, drilling into his soul. The darkness was trying to pull him back, pulling harder with each passing second. He was being dragged toward it. Closer, closer. He reached out toward the light, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the edge of its glow. The moment they touched it, a sharp, searing pain shot through his body. It wasn't just pain, it was burning. His skin felt like it was being torn open, his very soul being ripped apart. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The light pulsed, brighter, blinding, almost as if it were alive, fighting to stay lit. For a moment, the pain stopped. For a heartbeat, everything was still. And then, a voice, low and mocking, drifted from the shadows. You can't outrun it. The figure moved again, faster this time, closing the distance. He tried to move, but his body was no longer his own. The shadows wrapped around him like chains, pulling him into the dark. He felt his vision blur. The light was slipping away, but the figure's eyes, those eyes were still there, burning, relentless. And then everything shattered. A final scream caught in his throat. And the darkness consumed him, the darkness swallowed him whole, pulling him deeper than he thought possible. It was suffocating, a tight grip on his chest, stealing his breath. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, smothering every ounce of life. The silence around him was absolute, oppressive. Nothing but the beating of his heart in his ears. Then, slowly, impossibly, a whisper cut through the void. Faint, barely audible. Asterisk, you're here now, asterisk. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it was familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. The shadows around him twisted, alive with movement. They were closing in, tightening. He tried to move, to force himself to escape, but his limbs felt like lead. He could feel something beneath him, slick, wet, and cold, but the sensation made no sense. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body was frozen, caught in the pull of the darkness. The whispering intensified, growing louder, more frantic. The voices were overlapping now, a cacophony of distorted, twisted sounds. Asterisk, it's too late for you, asterisk. The words hit him like a slap. A wave of panic surged through him, but it only deepened the feeling of helplessness. He was trapped. He wasn't alone. He could feel the shadows closing in on him, pressing against his skin like 1,000 hands. Suddenly, a crack of light, a single, sharp burst of brightness pierced the dark, like a shard of broken glass. He blinked, his eyes adjusting, but it didn't help. The light flickered unstable, but it was enough to send a pulse of hope through him. He reached out toward it, his hand trembling. It felt like something was dragging him back, pulling him away from it. His feet shifted in the wetness beneath him, dragging through something foul and thick. And then a voice, deeper this time, like a rumble from the very core of the earth. You cannot fight it. Not here. The ground beneath him rumbled, shifting. Something someone was moving, circling him in the shadows. The air turned icy again, cold enough to freeze his very thoughts. His fingers brushed the light. For a split second, he felt warmth, an energy, a pulse of something more. But the moment his skin made contact, the light dimmed, flickered, and the shadows seized the opportunity. A hand, cold, clammy, gripped his wrist. The strength behind it was overwhelming. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The dark had already claimed him, and he could feel it, something other, something ancient, pulling him into its grasp. The figures in the shadows moved around him, surrounding him. He tried to fight back, but the more he struggled, the more the darkness squeezed. And then, a voice again, so close it sent a shiver down his spine. Welcome to the family, *. Before he could process the words, everything went still. And then, it was gone, everything went still. For a moment, he thought he might be free. The pressure on his chest, the cold grip of the shadows, * all gone star. But the silence was thick, heavy. It pressed against him, suffocating. He couldn't breathe. His heart pounded in his ears, louder than ever. The dark didn't fade. It was still there, surrounding him, waiting. Slowly, he managed to blink, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. But it felt as if his very vision had been clouded. There was something in the air, something alive. He could feel it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, prickling with unease. The silence stretched on, unbroken, unnerving. But then, a soft click, followed by another. The sound of something shifting, moving. A door, maybe? Or a lock, turning. * unlocking star. The click echoed like a signal. Something was changing. The shadows in the corners of his vision seemed to stir, shifting slightly, as though aware of him. A low, steady breath in the dark. Something or someone was near. It was as if the darkness was breathing, alive. * you're awake, *. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't the growl or the whispers or the mocking tone from before. This voice was calm, and yet it was filled with something far more dangerous. * control star. He couldn't see where it was coming from, but he could feel it. The presence was there, surrounding him. He could almost taste it. He forced himself to move, his limbs still heavy, but somehow he was able to take a step. The floor beneath him was slick, wet. Something cold clung to his skin, dripping. But he couldn't focus on it. The voice had his attention now. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was knowing. You thought you could escape, but you can't. The words settled into him like a weight, pressing deeper. And just as the shadows in the corners seemed to close in, another voice, so much louder, sharper, cut through the air. * it's time, *. The tone was final. There was no question. He couldn't deny it. Something was pulling at him, urging him forward, even as the darkness reached out to swallow him whole. The walls began to shift, bending, warping around him. The space, whatever it was, seemed to expand and contract, all at once. And then, for the first time since the darkness had claimed him, he saw a flicker of light. It wasn't warm, it wasn't inviting, it was blinding, and it was growing closer. In an instant, the figure appeared, a shadow within the light. Its eyes, those same burning eyes, stared at him, and he knew then that escape was impossible. The darkness wasn't just around him. It was inside of him. "You belong to us now," the voice whispered. And with those words, everything changed as the words echoed, a chilling promise that wrapped around him like chains. His body tensed, every muscle screaming in protest. But the voice had held him in place. "You belong to us now." The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing with an unearthly intensity. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The light around them pulsed, each beat matching the pounding of his heart. He couldn't look away. There was something in those eyes, something ancient star, a power, a force that seemed to suck the very will from his body. He could feel it, creeping through his veins, sinking into his skin. They were inside him. The darkness, the shadows, the cold, they were all a part of him now. The room, or whatever it was, seemed to bend again, warping and stretching in impossible ways. Everything felt unreal, like he was no longer in his body, but floating somewhere between worlds. The light flickered, then surged, brighter and harsher than before. And then the figure's voice, smooth and commanding, spoke again. "Don't fight it. You can't fight what you've become." His mind screamed. He wanted to break free, to run, to scream. But the force was too strong. The light was too strong. It was suffocating him, filling his lungs with a pressure he couldn't escape. He tried to close his eyes, but the darkness inside him kept them open, kept them locked in place. The light burned into his vision. It didn't hurt, not in the way he expected. It was worse. It consumed. The figure leaned in closer, its breath cold against his ear. "You've been marked," it whispered. "You are ours." A shudder ran through him, but there was no way to push it out, no way to push it away. His body felt foreign, like it didn't belong to him anymore. He could feel the transformation. Something was changing inside him, twisting his very essence. His mind was screaming for him to stop, to reject it, but he couldn't. The shadows, the family asterisk, were pulling him in, wrapping around him, consuming him from the inside out. He tried to move again, to force his body to fight, but it was like trying to fight a storm that had already taken root inside him. It was too late. "You are one of us now, asterisk." The voice was softer this time, almost soothing, and in that moment, he realized there was no escaping. He was already lost. The shadows around him pulled tighter. He could hear them now. Asterisk, whispers star. Too many to count. Too many voices, all of them calling his name. Asterisk, welcome, asterisk. And with that single word, the light shattered. The darkness swallowed him whole. And he was gone, but the darkness wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud, closing in tighter with every breath. It felt as though the very air itself was trying to smother him, to erase his presence entirely. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive weight of it pressing against him. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. It was as if his entire being had been swallowed up, absorbed into the abyss. And then, just when he thought he might drown in the blackness, a faint whisper cut through the silence. Asterisk, welcome to the family, asterisk. The words were familiar, chilling, like a cold wind cutting through his bones. He felt them, not just in his ears, but inside his mind, inside his very soul. The family, the shadows, they had claimed him. He could feel it now, coursing through him, like something cold and ancient wrapping itself around his heart. He wasn't alone anymore. They were with him. He could hear their whispers, soft and constant, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, just beyond the edge of his consciousness. They weren't just thoughts. They were commands. Asterisk, obey us, asterisk. Asterisk, serve us, asterisk. The pressure on his chest grew heavier. He could feel their eyes on him. Asterisk, watching asterisk, waiting. He wanted to fight it. He tried. But the more he struggled, the deeper the darkness sank into him. The more the whispers twisted inside his mind, wrapping around every thought, every desire. There was no escape. He couldn't even remember who he was anymore. The darkness was shaping him, changing him, making him a part of something far greater than himself. Something unstoppable. The cold that filled his chest began to spread, like ice crawling through his veins. He could feel it, asterisk them asterisk, inside of him. He wasn't just surrounded by the shadows anymore. He was the shadows. The weight lifted slightly, and for a moment he could feel the darkness thinning around him, just enough to see. A figure stood before him. The same eyes, the same burning, soulless stare. But this time, there was no fear, no resistance. The figure's voice came again, smooth and calm. Asterisk, you're ready, asterisk. The words rang through him, louder than anything he had ever felt. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a decree. He didn't have to ask what he was ready for. He already knew. The family had claimed him, and now he would serve them forever. The darkness surged inside him, overwhelming his every sense. It consumed him, and as he sank deeper, further into the void, he knew. There was no turning back. The void tightened around him, the pressure building until it felt like his chest would explode. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even feel himself anymore. But then, as if the shadows themselves had given him a moment of clarity, he heard a distant sound. A voice, soft at first, but growing louder. Asterisk, you belong to us now, asterisk. The words seeped into his mind like poison, wrapping around his thoughts, pulling them in, drowning him in their weight. He tried to fight, but it was pointless. The darkness inside him had already taken root. There was no escaping it. The more he struggled, the more the whispers grew louder, harsher. He could hear them now, clear as day. Asterisk, embrace it, asterisk. Asterisk, you are ours, asterisk. He wanted to scream, wanted to tear himself free, but his mouth wouldn't move. His body was no longer his own. It was their body now. The shadow around him stirred, alive, hungry. It was feeding on his fear, feeding on his resistance. And with every passing moment, he felt himself changing. Slowly, inevitable. The darkness didn't just surround him anymore. It was inside him. Every breath, every heartbeat was now a part of it. A part of them, the family. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting, always waiting. And then the voice returned. It wasn't the same voice from before. This one was deeper, more powerful. Asterisk, you were chosen, asterisk. The words hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him, drowning him in their meaning. He wasn't just another victim. He had been chosen, selected to join the family. The realization hit him with brutal force, and with it came a surge of clarity. This wasn't an end. It was a beginning, a transformation. He had already crossed the line. He was already part of the darkness. The voice, now almost a command, spoke again. Asterisk, serve us, or be consumed, asterisk. He didn't need to think about it. There was no choice anymore. Not for him. Not for anyone. The family had claimed him, and in that moment he knew there was no escaping. Not now. Not ever. The darkness tightened around him once more, and as it did, he felt himself meld with it. The cold became a part of him, the shadows his flesh, and as the last of his identity slipped away, he finally understood. He had become one of them, the family, forever. The darkness claimed him completely, and with it, the promise of eternal servitude began. The shadows enveloped him fully, consuming every last piece of his humanity. There was no resistance left. No more fight. He was part of them now. Asterisk, part of the family star. A part of something vast, something ancient, something that had always existed, lurking in the cracks between reality. His mind no longer belonged to him. It was theirs now. He could feel their presence, their thoughts, their desires merging with his own. It was overwhelming, suffocating, but it didn't matter, because the family had made him whole. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more distinct, and he could hear the voices of those who had come before him. Asterisk, serve us, asterisk. Asterisk, obey us, asterisk. Asterisk, be one with the shadows, asterisk. His body moved on its own, his limbs no longer under his control. He was a puppet, and they were the hands that guided him. He could hear the faint rustling of movement, the faintest whisper of footsteps. Their asterisk footsteps. The family was all around him, in the shadows, watching, waiting, and he was no longer the hunted. He was the hunter. The darkness that had once terrified him now pulsed with a strange power, a dark satisfaction. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but there was no fear, only a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. You're one of us now, The words drifted through him, but they weren't a command anymore. They were an affirmation, a truth. And then, as if responding to an unspoken order, he began to move, slipping through the shadows with ease. He could feel the energy of the family coursing through him, the pull of their ancient power urging him forward. He no longer needed to see. He could sense everything around him, the cracks in the walls, the coldness of the air, the faint pulse of life somewhere just ahead. It was all so clear. He was no longer a man. He was a shadow, a part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. And the family was with him. Every step he took was a step closer to the inevitable, closer to the mission, the task they had prepared him for. He was ready, and there was no turning back. The family's whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices in his head, a symphony of darkness and power. They weren't just speaking to him now. They were speaking through him. It's time, And as the last remnants of his former self dissolved into the shadows, he knew he had become the very thing he had feared. But in the end, it didn't matter, because now he was the darkness. The darkness felt familiar now. It was no longer something to fear, something to escape. It was a part of him, just as much as his blood, his breath, his heart. The family, his family, spoke through him, their voices flowing in perfect harmony, an endless river of whispers. Their presence surrounded him, guided him, shaped him. His every movement, every thought was part of the plan. He had become their instrument. No longer bound by the frailty of his former self, he moved with purpose. He felt the pull of their will, guiding him towards something he couldn't yet understand, but knew was coming. There were others like him, scattered in the shadows, waiting. They had all been claimed, transformed, remade. Each one of them was a piece of the family, and now he was one with them. His senses sharpened, his body stronger, faster. He could hear the faintest heartbeat from a mile away, feel the shift in the air as someone drew near. He was the predator now. The family's whispers grew more urgent, more insistent. Find them, bring them to us, He felt the command deep within his soul, a force too powerful to resist. Didn't matter who they were, where they were. The family had a way of finding them, and he was the one to bring them back. The streets were quiet, too quiet. The night stretched out before him, the shadows thick and heavy. He moved through them with ease, feeling the familiar rush of power that came with every step. There were whispers, distant voices, faint echoes of fear, but they didn't matter. He was beyond fear now. The family had made sure of that. And as he stepped into the alley, his eyes locked onto the figure standing at the far end. A person, a stranger, but to him, they were nothing more than prey. The family wanted them. He could feel it. His body moved before his mind could catch up. A blur of shadow, a predator in the night. The figure turned too late, their eyes wide with confusion. But it was no use. The family's power was already inside him, and once it had marked him, nothing could escape its reach. His hands were cold, like ice, as they closed around the stranger's throat. There was no struggle, no fight. The figure went limp in his grasp, and as they collapsed, the family's voice filled his mind, louder than ever. Good. Bring them to us. He didn't hesitate. Without a word, he slung the body over his shoulder, the weight light almost weightless. The family had spoken, and he would deliver. No questions, no hesitation. The darkness was his home now, and there was no escaping it. Not for him, and not for anyone else. The weight of the body felt almost comforting, like a reminder of his new purpose. The night air was cool, sharp against his skin, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. He moved through the dark streets with a strange ease, his footsteps barely making a sound. His senses were heightened, alert to every shift in the environment, every distant echo of life. The family's presence was always with him, pushing him forward. They whispered to him constantly, guiding him, shaping his every action. They were a part of him now, and he was a part of them. He could feel the anticipation growing within him, a slow burn that heated his veins. The stranger's body on his shoulder was a reminder of the price they paid for disobedience. The family's justice was swift. No mercy. He passed unnoticed, blending into the shadows. Nothing could see him. Nothing could stop him. His destination was clear. The family's hidden lair, a place buried deep beneath the city, concealed by layers of secrecy and darkness. No one ever spoke of it. No one ever had the chance. The closer he got, the more the darkness seemed to press in on him, suffocating, consuming. It was like walking through a veil of smoke, heavy with the promise of something inevitable. The lair was just ahead, a nondescript building, lost among the others. No one would ever know. He pushed open the door, his hand resting lightly on the cold metal, and the heavy scent of damp earth and old stone greeted him. The voices of the family were louder now, urging him inside, and he obeyed. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, sealing him off from the outside world. He entered the dimly lit corridor, the walls thick with shadows. There was no one in sight, only the whispers. Asterisk, bring them to the others, asterisk. He nodded silently, not needing to speak. He carried the body down the hallway, his eyes focused ahead. There were no questions anymore, no doubts. Only obedience. Finally, he reached the inner chamber where the others waited. Figures moved in the shadows, their eyes glowing with the same cold light that burned within him. They were his family now. He set the body down on the stone altar in the center of the room. The whispers intensified, rising in volume, vibrating through his bones. And then the leader stepped forward. A figure cloaked in darkness, their presence commanding and absolute. Asterisk, you did well, asterisk. The voice was deep, smooth, and devoid of emotion. The family had no need for praise, only results. He stood motionless, waiting for their next command. Asterisk now, we begin, asterisk. The words filled the room, a chilling promise of what was to come. The shadows shifted, gathering around the body, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as the ritual began. He could feel it, that power, that ancient energy, as it stirred in the depths of the lair. The family was growing, and he was part of its star. There was no going back. There was only this. This was his life now. This was his purpose. And as the shadows surrounded him, as the power surged through his body, he understood. He had been chosen for this, chosen to serve. And in the depths of that dark chamber, as the family's whispers grew louder, he knew. This was just the beginning. The darkness had always been there, lurking at the edges of his mind. But now it was him. Every shadow, every whispered command, every flicker of light was a thread that bound him closer to the family. And as the ritual unfolded before him, he felt the pull, a magnetic force drawing him deeper into the abyss. The others in the room moved with practiced precision, their eyes glowing with the same eerie, otherworldly light. They were all part of it now, part of the same machine, the same hunger. The body on the altar stirred ever so slightly, as if sensing the power that began to rise in the room. He could feel the energy flowing through the walls, through the ground beneath his feet. The family was feeding, growing stronger with each passing second. He stood still, his breath shallow, waiting for the moment. His heart, once human, now beat in rhythm with the darkness itself. Asterisk, it is time. Asterisk. The leader's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear, pulling him from his thoughts. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, joining the others. He could feel their presence, their thoughts merging with his own, the boundary between them blurring. They were all one now. The body on the altar was now fully still, its chest unmoving. The air in the room grew colder, heavier. And then, as if on cue, the shadows that filled the space seemed to flicker. A surge of power shot through him, and he gasped, his senses flooding with something far beyond human comprehension. It was as if the room itself had come alive, pulsing with energy, alive with ancient force. The body on the altar began to change. The transformation was slow at first, a shift in the air, an unsettling crackling sound as the shadows in the room thickened. The figure on the table convulsed, limbs twitching. And then, its eyes snapped open, asterisk, wide asterisk, empty, cold. They were not human eyes. They were the eyes of the family. They had been reborn, and with that, the last piece of his humanity slipped away completely. He was no longer just a man. He was one of them. The darkness was no longer just something he had joined. It had become him, and as the room filled with their whispers, he knew there was no escape, no turning back. He had been marked. He had been changed. He was theirs. Forever the shadows in the room settled, a heavy stillness descending like a suffocating cloak. The air was thick with the presence of the family, their power pulsing through the space like a living, breathing thing. He stood at the center, his mind clear but distant, anchored by the force that had claimed him. His body felt different now, stronger, yet hollow in a way that left no room for doubt. He was no longer himself. He was one of them, the family. There was no distinction anymore between where he ended and they began. The transformation had been complete, swift, and irreversible, and in the silence that followed, he knew this was his life now. The whispers faded into a calm, as if the family was at peace, waiting for the next task, the next move. He looked around the chamber, taking in the other figures who had once been strangers. Now they were family, brothers, sisters, each one of them marked by the same darkness, bound by the same unseen thread. He felt a strange comfort in that, a sense of belonging he hadn't known before. The leader, the one who had guided him through this transformation, stepped forward. Their eyes met, and without a word, the understanding passed between them. The family had risen, and there was no turning back, no escape from what they had become. The leader's voice cut through the heavy silence, low and powerful. Asterisk, you are ours now. Forever asterisk. The words echoed in the chamber, resonating in the very bones of the walls. He nodded, his eyes steady. He was beyond fear, beyond regret. The family was all that mattered now. He could feel the darkness surrounding him, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was freedom. A freedom built on silence, on shadows, on obedience. There was no longer any question of what came next. There was only the path laid out before them, the path they would walk together. And with that, he stepped forward, joining his family in the darkness, knowing without a doubt that he had found his true place, in the shadows, with them, forever.